My name is Diana Nichols-Blumey. I am a registered nurse, but I'm not a mandatory reporter for child or dependent adult abuse. The laws can be really confusing, kind of complicated, and we'll be discussing who are mandatory and who aren't. We're going to start off talking about child abuse. And child abuse isn't new. In fact, abuse of people isn't new. There are cave drawings that are abusive to people of all ages. There are cave drawings that are pornographic. So abuse has been around as long as people have been here. But the first case that ever went to court, the first child abuse case, was in 1874. And it wasn't even a human interest group that took that first case to court. It was the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And basically what they said is, our kids should have at least the same rights as our pets do. That was in 1874. Iowa didn't have a child abuse law until 1978, 104 years later. And it wasn't that Iowa was so far behind everybody else. Most states did not have a child abuse law until the mid-1970s. And then another complicated piece of the law is the difference between civil law and criminal law. With the exception of the Department of Corrections, the Department of Public Service, all of the other state departments operate under civil law. I work with the Department of Public Health. I cannot arrest anybody. I can't haul them off to jail, take them to court, or incarcerate them because I work under civil law. And so you say, well, child and dependent adult abuse should be a crime, and they are, but they're a crime under civil code. And so there has to be a mechanism to get that from the civil side to the criminal side in order to press charges, etc. So it can be very complicated, and I'll try to point out some of the differences as we go along. In order to have a child abuse report, there has to be three pieces to the puzzle. You have to have a child, you have to have a caretaker, and you have to have a circumstance. The definition of child is literally anyone under the age of 18. By Iowa law, a child isn't a child till birth, so you're talking from 1 minute up to 18 years of age. That's a wide span of ages, but it's also a wide span of abilities to talk to us, communicate, and tell us when there are problems. If you think about teenagers, if you remember your teenage years, if you have teenagers, you work with kids, you know it's a tough population to deal with just by virtue of their age range. But the additional problem with it is trust. Until you can develop that relationship and build that trust with them, they're not going to share what's going on. One of my favorite advertisements says, do you speak teen? The fact is we don't. We may think we do. Teenagers actually developed the language of text messaging. There are times that I can't read a text message, and I'll look around and say, is anybody under 18? Because I can guarantee they're going to be able to read it, even when I can't. And so they have their own language, their own codes. They want their own flag, their own anthem, their own country. They don't want to be part of us. And then when you add abuse to it, you've added additional problems. What about children who are too little, they're not mature enough to have communication skills? How are we going to work with them in an abuse situation? Well, trust is still a big part of that. But in addition to that, we're going to have to use all of our senses, our ability to see, hear, smell. We're going to have to use everything in order to identify and work with a child who cannot communicate with us. The same children would also include then children with disabilities who, because of some type of a disability, are unable to communicate. You're going to have to use everything that you know, all of your senses, in order to work with those kids. But trust is still the underlying factor in all age groups. And then we're talking about the caretaker. The caretaker also is a very wide variety of people. How many of you believe that teachers, educators, are caretakers? By law, they're not. Now, they are a mandatory reporter, but by law, they are not a caretaker. And so what happens if it is the teacher that is the perpetrator? This is the first example between civil and criminal law. If the teacher is the perpetrator, they are not the caretaker. It doesn't fall under child abuse, civil law. It falls under criminal code. Therefore, the teacher is going to have to be handled under criminal code, law enforcement, etc. Okay? And think about it. Sometimes we don't realize how easy it is for us to become a caretaker. If my kids are down the street playing with yours and something happens, potentially, you could be charged as the caretaker because you have assumed that responsibility and you may not even know my kids are there. Will you be charged? Possibly. And so you have to be aware of the fact anytime that there are kids around. And then what about children that are in a babysitting role? So we have children taking care of children. Okay, in that particular case, yes, they are still a child, but they also have stepped into a caretaking situation. If that, in fact, something happens, that child can be charged. They can be charged as a juvenile offender. Okay, we'll talk about what parent roles are in that in just a moment. In the last year, we have had two 15-year-olds responsible for the death of the children that they were taking care of. We had a 15-year-old young man who beat a 2-year-old to death. We had a 15-year-old that sexually assaulted a 3-year-old and then strangled her to death. In both of those cases, the criminal code so far outweighed the civil law on child abuse that immediately jumped to law enforcement to be dealt with. Now, the Department of Human Services kept in touch with what was happening because if, in fact, for some reason, these two young men had not been convicted, if it didn't continue under criminal law, it would have gone back to the Department of Human Services under civil law to be dealt with. But then let's take it beyond. Who hired the children? Who's responsible for their maturity, their behavior, etc.? That could go either way. It could, in fact, be that there could be that the parents of the 15-year-olds could be looked at. What is their responsibility? But it also could be the responsibility of the caretakers of the young children. Did they hire an inappropriate babysitter? And so the caretaker can be a wide variety of people, and the responsibilities can be expanded beyond just that person that's taking care of the child. And then we have the third C, the circumstance. What is it that you suspect? And the law is that you are reporting suspected abuse. So it is what do your senses tell you? What do you see? Do you hear? Do you know? Someone has reported to you? It is not our right, it's not our responsibility to investigate, to ask all of the questions, and to make a decision of whether it has happened and we are going to report or not report. Our legal obligation is to report suspected abuse. Now that gives a few different professions a bit of a challenge because medical professionals, law enforcement are trained to ask questions, are trained to investigate, to find out more details. And so within your boundaries of your profession, you're going to continue those. But from the standpoint of the law on child abuse, you report suspected abuse up front. You do not investigate. And then there's an exception. Unfortunately, a lot of times when any type of a law is written, somebody is going to make an exception to it. And this one literally makes no sense. You have to have 3 C's. You have to have a child, a caretaker, and a circumstance. Unless you have a child that is under the age of 12 and they are sexually assaulted and there's no caretaker, it still is child abuse. If the child is 12 and over and there's no caretaker, it isn't. For example, my 11 and 12-year-old daughters are at a playground. There are no other people there. There are no adults there. Someone comes out of the woods and sexually assaults my 11-year-old. So we have an 11-year-old, so we still have a child. We have a circumstance because we have a sexual assault. And there's no caretaker. Based on the exception, this still meets the child abuse law. My 12-year-old daughter is also sexually assaulted by the same perpetrator. We still have a child. We still have a perpetrator. We still don't have a caretaker. Based on the exception to this law, my 12-year-old is going to be dealt with under criminal code. My 11-year-old is going to be dealt with first under child abuse. And then obviously the perpetrator is going to be dealt with under criminal code. And so it's going to depend on what does the law actually say. And that's basically why our responsibility is to report suspected abuse. Let somebody else solve all of the details and the problems with it. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the offenders. If you watch TV, you watch movies, pretty much they're color-coded for us. The bad guy, if they've already been arrested, usually has on an orange jumpsuit or they've got black and white stripes. We can look at them and say, okay, I know who the bad guy is. But sometimes we don't realize who else is out there. Think about yourself. How many of you got up before 5 o'clock this morning? How many of you have worked part or all of the day prior to taking the class? How many of you are tired? How many of you don't feel well? How many of you have a dependent at home, either a child or an adult? You know, if someone didn't say, okay, she's not talking about me, it's because I didn't ask the right question. Because the fact is, 100% of us, as well-intentioned professionals, still potentially are going to step over the line. There are times that we are very overwhelmed with life. There are times we are totally out of our coping skills. There are times that coworkers are missing and we needed them there, so we're working a double. There could be the fact we had a flat tire on the way into work. Our computer isn't working. A flood has hit. There are all kinds of challenges that we go through every day that potentially is going to impact our ability to function at the peak of our capabilities. And when that happens, when a professional becomes overwhelmed and step over the line, generally it's because they don't have any coping skills left. It is still an offense. We do not have the right to do that. If as a professional we step over the line, generally it's verbal. We say something we shouldn't have said. We may use a tone of voice we shouldn't have used. If it's physical, generally we're talking about a tap. It might be a swat. We're not talking about beating the snot out of anybody. We have still stepped over the line. And then let's take it to the community. We have a lot of really great caretakers, parents, grandparents, siblings, people taking care of other people. Same thing. There are times that they have absolutely no coping skills left. I know a few years ago, the Department of Public Health sent a team of interviewers into one of our flooded areas of the state. And as they were talking to the victims of the flood, some really great people, you know, most of the time when you're doing an interview, somewhere you get to the mental health questions. And about page 10, there's a question that says, have you ever thought about committing suicide? Based on that answer, the next question is, did you ever try it? And based on that answer, the third question is, what did you try? As they were talking to the flood victims at that time, most of them didn't even get a chance to get to those questions. And the caregivers were going, you know, just wait a minute. You want to know how bad it really is here? I've thought about committing suicide, and I know what I would do. So when you're thinking about caretakers that are that stressed, what's the risk to the child? The second type of offender, the person who is well-intentioned but ignorant. Have any of you ever had a job where they hired an idiot? You know, there are times that we're working with people that just don't get it. They are totally ignorant of what it's going to require to do that job. You know, I'm not sure why it's our responsibility to teach them how to do it. But especially in an economic downturn, we're going to find people that are going to be lying on their job applications. They're going to lie on their resumes. They're taking jobs that they may not fit. They may not have that fit. They may not have the knowledge skill to do that. And so once again, our kids are at a big risk when you're talking about that person. Okay? Take it back out to home. What about the 14-year-old who's given birth to a child and chooses to keep it? You know, they haven't even been an adult. They've only been a child themselves for, you know, a teenager for 2 years. And suddenly they're responsible for a newborn 24/7. And one of the classic problems that we see is Kool-Aid in a baby bottle. You know, I'm not knocking Kool-Aid, okay, but for a newborn, we're talking the wrong nutrition. And so we're potentially setting that child up to fail because of the ignorance of a 14-year-old that's a mom. And then when we go down to people who are unwilling, could care less. We do have people, anytime we have a downturn, anytime the stressors are, economic problems hit, jobs are hard to get. We have people that are taking jobs for the wrong reasons. There are people that are taking it strictly for a paycheck that really could care less about what standard of job that they are doing. And then taking it back out to the community. What about the single mom? And I'm not knocking single moms. But there reaches a time, you've been dealing with children, that you've got to socialize. Now, it could, yes, she may be working out, she may be, you know, being with other adults during the day or whatever her shift is, but that's not really socialization. As soon as she makes the decision that she needs to get out, she's going to actually check her finances compared to an evening out. Can I pay for a babysitter and an evening out? You know, if the answer is yes, then the chances are she'll make the attempt to get a caretaker for the children. If she can't get one, or she doesn't have the finances to get one, a lot of times the children are going to be left. They may be left at home. They may be left in a car. You know, because the need to socialize is greater than the need to protect the children at that time. The last two that are on it, the abusive personality and the sadistic personality, these are both 100% psychosocial deviants. The abusive personality, the best example I have ever heard is a flasher. You know, a flasher goes like this, we go, ah! They just won the game. That is all they wanted to do, is to scare the crap out of us. And they got the job done. The abusive personality is always looking for an audience. And kids are the world's best audiences. I'm going to talk later, but the same types of offenders are the same for dependent adults. And dependent adults make probably the second best audience for an offender. If you think about children from the moment they're born, it's fairy tale time. Most of the books that we are reading to them, they're originally reading, clear up until pretty much close to kindergarten, is all fairy tale, is all fiction. You know, the movies that they watch, the cartoons, you know, there's really very little about reality in there until they have reached pretty close to school age. So children are used to being entertained. They are a great audience. They may not realize that they are in trouble. If they do realize in trouble, a lot of times it's too late. The situation has gone too far. The sadistic personality is 100% about pain and control. The more that person can control us, whether it is physically, emotionally, mentally, that control and that pain, the better off they feel about themselves. It has nothing to do with how we feel as the victim. We're going to find all 5 levels of offenders everywhere we find children and everywhere we find dependent adults, including potentially where you work. There are 10 separate categories of child abuse. We're going to take them individually. This just gives you a quick overview. When we're talking about physical abuse is generally not an accident. I accidentally stabbed them with a knife. I accidentally burned them with a steam iron. You know, it isn't usually an accident. And then a lot of times there's a difference in the history, or basically the story. What does the child say? What does the caretaker say? A child may say, Mommy shoved me down the steps. Well, right away, Mom can't allow that to ride because she has just been accused of abusing her child. So she's got to change that picture. She may turn to the child and say, you know, you have been told that you are to sit here and be quiet. It's that old philosophy of it's better to be seen and not heard. But the message that the child gets is if you open your mouth again, you're going to really get it when we get home. And so the child may sit back and be very quiet and not continue to tell what really happened. The other way that the caretaker may go is, you know, Di, I am so sorry. He lies about everything. He doesn't know how to tell the truth. So from my perspective, if I'm the one that's going to be, you know, investigating this and asking the questions, the tendency is to go toward the adult who obviously should know if their child is a liar. And so we're going to leave the child out when their story is probably what really happened. And so we have that problem with that difference in history. The word omissions, you're going to find pretty much throughout all types of abuse. And basically what that means is that the caregiver omits the safety, they can be just as guilty. So if my significant other is physically abusive to me, there would be a probability that he would be abusive to my kids, and yet I leave them in his care. If they are physically abused in my absence, he can be charged as the perpetrator of physical abuse. I can be charged with physical abuse based on omission because I failed to keep my child safe. And so you can be charged in addition to the perpetrator based on omission. And then what is foreseeable? You know, if I look out in the middle of the street and there's my 2-year-old standing there, if I leave the child in the street, it is foreseeable that the child is going to be injured. A vehicle won't stop on time, they may not even see the child. I don't want that to happen, so I run across the yard, I grab the child, and I bring them back to safety. In the process of that, I scratch them. That's not foreseeable. It does every time you grab a child to protect them, to save them, to pick them up, it doesn't mean you're going to scratch them. So that's really not foreseeable. But I'm upset. I haven't run a 100-yard dash since I was a senior in high school. I'm out of shape. Heart's pounding. I'm having problems breathing, and I grab the child and I go, what were you doing out there? Now is it foreseeable my actions are going to hurt the child? Yes. You know, we have a rule. You don't leave the yard. I take off my belt to strike the child. Now, is it foreseeable they're going to be injured if I strike them with a belt? Definitely. If I reverse it and use the buckle end, you can guarantee damage. And then it doesn't have to be observable. Okay, so you have a 12-year-old that comes in to tells you that they have been spanked so hard the night before they can't sit down. You don't say, drop your drawers, let me see. Okay, you do not have to see the injury or the damage to make the report. You can report based on what a child has told you. Now, that does give us some problems, especially if you're in the medical profession, law enforcement, where you are trained to ask the questions, you are trained to follow through. But remember, from the standpoint of an abuse report, we are reporting what we suspect. Now, if we know the details on everything, we can add those to the report, but our job is not to investigate first and then report. Our job is to report suspected abuse. Okay? The other time that doesn't have to be observable count. As long as the child is under the age of 18, anything that they report to you that has happened in their past, you have to make that report. So say a 17-year-old says that they were sexually assaulted at age 14. You probably were not involved with them at all when they were 14, but they have told you about an abusive situation. You have got to make the report based on what they have said. Okay? And so as long as they are under 18, what they tell you has happened, you have to make that report. Now, most of the time, and we are used to asking a lot of questions, and sometimes we forget about nonverbal communication. I know my dad told me that if I ever sat on my hands, I wouldn't be able to talk at all, because I do use my hands when I'm talking. And so sometimes we're not aware of what our body language is saying to us. And so I may be saying to a child, did your mommy do this? And I may not even be aware that I'm giving them a verbal cue. The child may say, I really want Di on my side, so, my mommy did this. When in fact it might not have been mom. They may have been picking up on what I was communicating. So we have to be very careful of what questions we ask, because once again, it isn't our responsibility to ask the questions. But a couple questions that are important to ask. One is, have you ever been hurt like this before? That might give you that 17-year-old that was sexually assaulted when they were 14. A child may say, every time mommy goes off the wagon, I get it. Anytime daddy's laid off, I get hurt. And so those would be additional pieces that you would add to the report. But another question that not only is important to ask, but in a way sometimes can be critical to ask, is do you hurt anywhere else? It could be that that 12-year-old that's been spanked so hard they can't sit down may actually have been kicked in the ribs. It could be that because the pain is so much greater in one area of their body, they may not tell you that they have got damage somewhere else. And you may be faced with an emergency situation. If you have a cracked or a broken rib, potential lung puncture, etc. So you may suddenly be faced with needing an ambulance, need emergency services, but you haven't caught that if you haven't asked the question. This is not an eye chart, although I realize that it's very hard to see. If you happen to have this as a handout, it's even tougher. The idea isn't to stress your vision. The idea is to show you that when we are talking about physical abuse, it can be in an ascending order of severity. At the bottom of the scale are scratches, cuts, and bruises. At the very top is murder and death. Sometimes scratches, cuts, and bruises are very minor. Sometimes cuts and bruises are actually the cause of the death. So it doesn't necessarily mean that any of the things on the bottom of the scale are minor. Sometimes abuse starts at the very bottom with scratches, cuts, and bruises. And sometimes it stays there. Sometimes abuse starts somewhere farther up on the chart and stays there. Sometimes abuse starts at the very top with the death of the child. Sometimes, if the frustration continues to climb, you may see actually jumping from category to category to category into more severe areas as the frustration and the abuse continues. So scratches, cuts, and bruises, something that you can see, that the child can report to you. Looking at the next step with burns. Burns usually always look like what was used. A cigarette burn is a small round circle. Sometimes we'll have caretakers say, but I was just flicking the ash off of my cigarette, and the child or the dependent adult, since it's the same scale, reaches in front of it. It's not going to be a round circle. You've got two moving objects. It can't be a circle. Curling irons are used. It's a long, skinny burn. Steam irons, it's the pointed side rather than the back side that's used. If you see any type of a coil or a rounded edge, generally we're talking about the top of an electric stove. With rope burns, you're going to find them at wrist, at ankle, sometimes actually around the neck, or you might find them in other parts of the body, especially if they didn't have clothing on with those areas. And then liquid burns. Liquid burns generally are either coffee or water. And sometimes, again, it's just that flash point of frustration and upset, and a glass or a cup of hot water or coffee will just literally be thrown at the child. It's just that, and the child will end up with a splash effect. There will be no straight lines, even surfaces. The liquid is going to splash. But then there are some times that body parts are dumped. We do see this more in children than we see in independent adults. You know, a child, depending on their size, very easily their hand could be small enough to literally fit down into a cup or a glass. And so you may see a hand that is burned. It'll end up with a straight line at the wrist. Sometimes those are referred to as a glove type of burn. Sometimes feet are dumped, feet first, into hot bath water or any type of a hot liquid. It could even be something on the stove. Sometimes that's out of neglect. If the bath water hasn't been tested first, it could be that the bath water is too hot, that the child steps in or is placed into bath water that is too hot. Sometimes it's done as a deliberate punishment to the child. But the burn is going to end in a straight line, and sometimes referred to as an anklet burn, because the foot will be burned up to the level of where you would have a stocking end. Sometimes we see it, we don't see it in adults, we do see it in children, where a child is bent in a knee-chest position and dunked bottom first into a hot liquid. Once again, you're going to end up with that straight line across there. So the difference in the burns, if you've got that splash mark, usually it's been thrown. If you have a straight line, it's been an immersion or a dunking type of burn. You know, I know all of us, or a lot of us, have ever had a crack in the corner of our mouth. And usually when it happens, it's wintertime in Iowa and the humidity is down. So sometimes, because that's when we have a problem with it, we may not think of what other things could cause that kind of damage. A person that has been gagged can also cause that amount of damage to it. Because the purpose of gagging someone is to shut them up. So if you're going to intend to gag me, you're going to have to catch me first because I'm going to run. Then you're going to have to tie me up, so potentially I'm going to have more damage because I'm going to fight you with everything I've got. And then the gag's got to be tight enough because I can actually still teach this class until... And when it reaches the point that I can't teach the class, you've gotten the job done. But not only are the corners of my mouth at risk, but so is my tongue. We will see a straight line bruise across the tongue. We might see straight line bruises across one earlobe or both. And we may see missing hair across the back because they're not going to pay attention if my hair is tied into the knot. When they want to take off the gag, they're going to yank it off. There goes my hair, possibly there goes a pierced earring. We could have a lot of damage done because of that. I once heard a great-granddaughter tell her great-grandmother, if you don't shut up, I'm going to stuff a washcloth in your mouth. Later on, I had an opportunity to take care of the great-grandmother, and we actually picked washcloth fibers out of her teeth. And so gagging, a lot of times we're going to overlook a lot of the symptoms with that. When we jump up to the middle category, hypothermia, low body temperature, sometimes that's the child's fault that it's not abuse. My office in the Des Moines area is about 2 blocks from East High School. In the early spring, as soon as the temperature hits 40 degrees, every kid at the bus stop is wearing flip-flops, short shorts, a tank top, and a cell phone. It's not warm enough to be dressed like that. So in fact, but that's their fault if they are dressing that way and their body temperature is going down. But then when I was a nurse manager of a hospital, part of our responsibility was to give back to the community. My favorite thing to do was to, talk to the kids at breakfast time at the schools. And one morning when I got to this school, there was a little 6-year-old in the cafeteria, and they had her all wrapped up in a blanket, and she just was shivering. When the custodian got to school that morning, he found this little 6-year-old lying on a snowdrift out in front of the school. She wasn't well hidden at all. Fortunately, she was very obvious. Also, fortunately, it was not a weekend or a holiday. School actually was on. He found her. He was able to get to her before she actually started having severe effects from a lowered body temperature. But when the abuse started at her house in the middle of the night, she ran. She ran to the one place that meant safety to her, her school. But she didn't take time to grab her coat, her mittens, and her boots. She ran barefoot in her jammies. You know, if he hadn't found her, her body temperature could have dropped, and it could have been a severe problem for her. When we're talking about starvation or malnutrition, you know, we don't see as much of that super skin and bones look, not only the tiny bodies, but the bug eyes, the little pot belly. We don't see as much of the physical characteristics of starvation in Iowa and in most of the states as we do see in other countries. Current statistics, there are over 700 children a day dying in Africa because of starvation. We don't have the problem to that severe of a degree in the United States. But what we might see in the United States, we might see in Iowa is behavior. I don't know if you've ever passed a convenience store just as a child has run. Generally, it's because they have stolen something. Now, it might be something they just want, but if they are hungry, they will steal food and run. And their body instinctively will grab a high-energy food, a candy bar versus an apple or a banana. You know, yes, it tastes better also, but their body will grab for something that's a higher energy food. But what we might see as far as behavior in our schools, in our medical centers, is hoarding. If a child is served any type of food, anything that's not covered, which is usually your meat, potatoes, those type of things, anything that's not covered, they will eat it just absolutely as fast as they can because they're going to be afraid you'll take it away from them. So they'll eat that real fast. But anything that is covered, cracker packages, pudding cups, beverages, they'll hoard. They'll stash them in their backpack, in their locker, in a bedside stand at a medical facility, in the closet. And part of that is because they know what hunger is like. And at 2 o'clock in the morning when they get hungry, they know they have a stash of food. But even more importantly than that is when they go home, whether it's home from school or home from being discharged from any type of a medical facility, they actually go home the hero because they bring a gift of food to brothers and sisters who are also hungry. And so it is a psychological element to that too. So in the United States, we see more behavior than that physical skin and bones look. When we're talking about dehydration, lack of body fluid or low body fluid, some of you are going to be familiar with the term turgor, skin turgor, and some of you aren't. But what I would like you to do is just to take a moment just to take the skin of the back of one hand and just to pick it up and then let it go. Does it smooth back out fairly fast? If it does, then you've got good hydration. You've got enough fluid in your tissue. If it doesn't, if it stays peaked up, then you are slightly or severely dehydrated. Because of a medical condition, mine actually does stay peaked up like that. I don't deliberately not drink before I do any type of training. But so if it's peaked up like that, it means I'm about a quart low. I need to pump some fluids. I was doing a training and there were no medical people in the group at all. And before I could say the reason that it does that, mine does that, is because of dehydration or lack of fluid. The person in the front row said, and the reason yours does that is you're old. Oh, it's like... So we had a little bit of challenges there. We discussed verbal abuse versus how to react. The fact is, it is not a symptom of aging. It is a symptom of dehydration. Okay, and so think about it. I was teaching a high school class, and one of the football players said they start practicing in August. The coach blows the whistle and yells skin check. And all of the football players check their skin for hydration. So it's a good tool to know, something to watch for. When we're talking about contractures, the very bottom of that section, contractures are when the ligaments, the tendons, the muscles of the joints atrophy, shrink, contract, contracture. We don't see a lot of them in children, unless we're talking about someone with cerebral palsy, or if the child has been tied up, caged, confined, some way that they can't stretch and exercise. Otherwise, we see more of those in adults than we see in children. At the top of the next scale there is detached retina. The retina is the back of our eyeball. It's what allows us to see. So if that becomes detached or torn, and the emergency surgery doesn't occur fast enough, there's a potential for partial or complete blindness. The number one cause of a detached retina in a child is shaken baby. Child is grabbed and is shaken, and literally their skull and their brain are colliding, and it can tear or detach that retina. The second cause of a detached retina in a child is slammed baby, dropped head first on the floor or literally picked up and whopped against a wall, a table surface. It's that hard, sudden jolt between brain and skull. But if you think about the size of a child that I could pick up and slam, or I could pick up and shake, we're talking about our smallest of our kids. We're talking about the kids that can't say, Di, half this room disappeared, or there's a problem here. And so unfortunately, because they can't tell us what the problems are, there's a good probability they're not going to get surgical help fast enough to preserve some sight. So we're going to end up with a partial or even a total blindness because they have been shaken. When we're talking about pressure sores, we don't see as many pressure sores or that decubitus in children as we see in adults. But what we do see in children generally is skin breakdown starts as diaper rash. Babies' diapers aren't being changed. If you have a chronic bedwetter, you might hear, you wet it, you live in it. And so they're not allowed to change wet soiled clothes. Starts out as diaper rash, and it continues. The skin will just continue to break down. When we're talking about choking, the basic intent behind choking someone is to choke them to death. If the perpetrator is intending to get the job done, they will come armed. They'll bring a tie, a wire, a cord, something to get the job done. But a lot of times it's just that total frustration, just like that cup of water or that cup of coffee being thrown. It's just reaching out and grabbing. And I don't know if you've ever driven long distances, when you've got your, especially white knuckle, and you try to unclench your hands. Sometimes it's really hard to do. The same thing, the stress of choking can cause that same effect. And so sometimes there was no intent, but they still get the job done. When we move up to the top, where we're talking about murder and death, like I say, sometimes, abuse starts lower down. Sometimes it starts at the top. We lost a lot of kids in Iowa. We have found them in dumpsters and ditches, and we throw away children. We had, in 2001, the Iowa legislature passed the Safe Haven Law. And basically what that meant is, as long as the child was under 14 days, we're talking about under 2 weeks, they could be taken back to any type of a medical base. Usually you're talking your medical center. But it could also be your EMS service with your fire department, a school nurse, a dentist, as long as there's that medical base there. If the parents are taking the child back under 14 days and give up their rights, they are not going to be charged with child abandonment or child endangerment. I don't know if you tracked what happened in Nebraska this last year. Nebraska passed a safe haven law, and they didn't put an age limit on it. The number one age of the kids that were brought to Nebraska to be given up were 16-year-olds. They had them flying in from other states. They had them crossing the borders. 16-year-olds, because I just can't deal with this anymore. So Nebraska had to have an emergency legislative session, and they put the limit as 1 year. Iowa is 14 days. Nebraska is 1 year. We had a father in Iowa that popped his 3 kids in the bathtub. The 1.5-year-old slipped under the water while Dad was downstairs playing computer games. The 3-year-old and the 4-year-old didn't realize their little sister was in trouble. They got out of the bathtub and went into their room to play. Their little sister drowned. Father is serving time. We had a mom who drowned her newborn and hanged herself, murder-suicide. And so on a daily basis, we're going to see those cases. Gisetta Gage, a 9-year-old that was a sexual assault, kidnap, and murder. Shelby Duaz, a methamphetamine murder. And so we have those cases in Iowa. Nationally, we had a 14-year-old that gave birth to a child in the bathroom at school. I can't imagine a more horrendous place to give birth. She gave birth to the child. She panicked. She tried to flush the baby. Plumbing, newborn, and the baby drowned. So now you have a 14-year-old that's responsible for the death of her child the rest of her life. We had a mom and dad. There had been no domestic violence situations. There had been no previous child abuse cases. There was an older brother and sister. They had a 2-month-old. Mom left the baby with Dad and went shopping. When she got back, the baby was in his swing and he wasn't moving. She rushed him to the emergency room where he was pronounced dead. He had been shaken so hard, the amount of bleeding in his skull and the pressure of it is actually what killed him. Both retina were totally detached. Even had he gotten there in time, even if he had lived, he would have had visual damage, both eyes, because of the severity of the problem. And when they checked his little body, you could actually count the numbers of fingers and thumbprints on his rib cage. Okay. They're lost in not only the youngest child in the family, Dad is serving time. So sometimes, abuse starts at the bottom. Sometimes it starts at the top with the death of a child, with a lot of areas in between. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the dental field actually has done a phenomenal job investigating and thinking about their field, their profession, and child abuse. And what they have found is that they have found a lot of children that have damage to the oral cavity that is really abusive. Force feeding is the number one problem. They'll actually see, scar tissue in the mouth. The frenulum, which is that little piece of skin between your lip and your gum, can be torn because of force feeding. They've seen, food jammed in that was too hot with actually blisters and burn scars. And so force feeding can cause a lot of damage. They also found that they had a lot of oral sexual damage. So they had, indications looking at their oral cavity. And it's a field that most of us, are not involved in. It's something that we wouldn't see or witness. And so the dental field has really done a great job of investigating those type of situations. I'm going to look at some pictures, and you do have my approval, my permission to close your eyes or to turn away. You don't have to look at photos. This child was taken to the emergency room. The caretaker said that he was crawling on the carpet, and he slipped and he fell, and he hit the side of his face into the leg of the coffee table. If you ever see anybody with that much damage, you make the report, regardless of what the story is. Unless you happen to have been on site at the time it happened when you actually knew how that had happened. Otherwise, you need to look at it as compared to history. Number one thing that's wrong with this story is, in addition to damage, the child's too young to crawl. History doesn't match, the story doesn't match. Okay? And so, in fact, when they were challenged, the caretaker said, "You're right, that isn't what happened. We had him sitting in his car seat on the couch, and we didn't have it secured. And as he wiggled and he moved, he rolled over, he fell off the couch, and the car seat landed on top of him. That's probably what happened." But you've got two stories. You're going to have to make that report based on the amount of damage. This baby is too young to do anything. I mean, she isn't going to break curfew. She's not going to run away. She's not going to sass back. The only thing she does is baby things. Eat, sleep, drink, cry, etc. She has been slapped so hard that those two purple or dark red stripes are actually blood blisters from between the fingers. So it's the mark between the fingers. Something that's a real controversy are the dating of bruises. So when I'm not talking about it, then I'm not going to challenge that. We're not going to be scientific about it. But I want you to think, anytime you see bruises, I want you to think rainbow. A rainbow has a minimum of 8 colors. If you see a child with multiple colors of bruises, it's more than one incident, more than one time. So that rainbow effect of bruises is more than one time that person has been injured. This child has been struck at least twice. They've got yellows, greens, and browns of old bruises, but they also have a lot of reds, blues, and purples of newer bruises. A rainbow effect, multiple colors. Ears are something else we don't think a lot about. And unless you're changing a pierced earring or, you get water in it, most of the time we don't think about our ears. When I was in 2nd grade, our music teacher had us sit in this big circle on the floor, and he'd walk the circle. If any of us misbehaved, he just came up and picked us up by our ears, full body weight against your ears. But what we don't realize is that this part of our ear is just the funnel of hearing. The whole hearing mechanism is actually inside our head, protected by our skull. As much damage as can be done to the outside could reflect the amount of damage done on the inside to the mechanism of hearing. This child has the bruising that goes all the way to that back curve of his hairline. He could easily have that much bleeding inside. He does have a broken eardrum. It was pretty much a direct side pop, and it blew his eardrum. This could very easily be that 12-year-old that tells you that they've been spanked so hard they can't sit down. This child was beaten with a PVC pipe. Bite marks are something else we don't think a lot about. Now, if this were a dog bite, we'd all panic. Where's the dog? We have him confined. Does a child have to have rabies shots? But the fact is, humans bite more often than dogs do. And the human bite is the most dangerous animal bite in the world. There are over 600 types of bacteria, germs, viruses in the human mouth. And so the human bite is more often than a dog bite, and with the exception of rabies, it's most dangerous. But then is it an adult bite or a child bite? Sometimes when a child will bite is usually in that growth and development, just about the time they start to teeth, where they're gnawing on everything. And so it's an experiment in life. They bite. Usually they don't do it more than once, maybe twice. A lot of times it's the taste. If they're biting into skin that's got, lotions, creams, soaps, etc., colognes, it doesn't taste good and they won't bite again. But more often it's they bite, they get whopped, and they don't bite again. But then, is it an adult bite? Where we see adults biting children is basically when someone says, Susie bit Tommy in daycare today, or Susie just bit Mommy. And the mom will say, how would you like to know how that felt? And they'll bite the child to show bites hurt. And then we have psychosocial deviants that will gnaw. It's like corn on the cob. It's a punishment technique. So don't ignore it. Bites are very, very dangerous. This would be a cigarette burn. Goes all the way down to the knuckle. Rope burns. Ankles also had the burns, the rope burns there. The child had been tied. Sometimes we're seeing these in drug cultures, and it's totally inappropriate, but it's a protection, a safety measure. We're going to cook meth at my house tonight, and my kid's a Houdini. I can put him down for his nap. He can get out of any baby bed, any door. I don't want him out here with all the meth and everything, so I'm just going to tie him in his bed to keep him safe. We're also seeing them sometimes not necessarily as a protective measure, but as an immobilization, to keep them confined. We do see them in sexual situations where a child is being tied up. And then there are other times that it's just tie the child up to keep them out of the way. This would be considered an anklet burn, where a child is dunked feet first into hot water. When we're talking about fractures of children's bones don't have as much calcium in them as the adult bone. If you pick up a twig off the ground, you can bend, it'll break pretty fast, pretty much a complete straight across type of break. But if you cut one off of a tree, you can bend, eventually it will break. It usually will break at an angle. So a lot of times children's fractures are referred to as green stick fractures because they don't break clear through and they break at that angle. So we have this one, it could be even a twisting type where you're pulling in opposing directions. With this one, this is the femur or the thigh bone, so it's a pretty solid bone. You can see pretty much is broken straight across. Caretaker said that the baby was taking his nap, and as he wiggled and he moved while he was asleep, he dropped his leg through the bars on the bed. When he woke up, he was on one side, his leg was on the other, and he twisted and he turned and he pulled until he broke his own leg. Okay, first of all, as humans, we have a pain threshold. It is very individual to us. When we reach our pain threshold, we will quit fighting. He would have reached his pain threshold before he got to the point of breaking his leg. But let's say he did. Let's say that really did happen that way. Iowa law says that the bars on a baby's bed cannot be wider apart than 2 3/8 inches wide. That is the width of a pop can. That's not the width of your plastic pop bottles. Okay, 2 3/8 inches. One, he couldn't have gotten his little leg through that gap. The other thing is, though, that say we're using great-grandma's antique bed, and so the bars are farther apart. It's our legal responsibility to make sure the child can't get a head, a limb through the bars of the bed. It would have to be netted, bumpered, etc. It's the caretaker's responsibility. But even beyond that, this child, even if he broke his own leg, he's going to be screaming bloody murder. Where were the caretakers? Somebody should have heard him screaming. Where that arrow is a depressed skull fracture. Mom said she was doing the laundry. She came through the kitchen. The child was in his high chair, and she just accidentally hit him in the back of his head with the laundry basket. How many of you have ever had a black eye? You know, think about, where was it black? And for most of us, we're going to say that it was our cheekbone, that most of it. Sometimes all the way around, you know, all the way around, especially if we were hit with a fist or a baseball. I know someone, she said that she fell off her bicycle and the handlebars came and she landed straight down. So it's usually a direct blow to the eye, which will give it that circular type of motion there, that bruising. Anytime you see that it's just the upper eyelid, you need to think about what's going on with it, because generally you're talking about emergency. We're generally talking about a fracture of the skull above that point. Where that dip is in her eyebrow, the skull is fractured. Father doubled up his fist and he hit her and he caught her high here and literally broke the skull at that point. The only time personally I have ever, just once have I ever seen to that extent. My guys were playing football and they were in weight training. There weren't any adults, there weren't any caretakers around. One of the guys was bench pressing and another one was curling and dropped the dumbbell. You know, landed right there, instant skull fracture, immediate, just the upper eyelid. It's very, very distinctive if you see it. Mongolian spots are tough. A Mongolian spot is a birthmark. You can see it here on the child's forehead, down across the temple and across the cheek. In this little boy, you can see it around his knee and around his ankle. You can see that the colors are darker. You know, we find them in newborns with darker complexions at birth. It can be African Americans, also Asians, Hispanics, Italians, Mid-East, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Filipinos, Hawaiians. Any newborn that's born with a darker complexion, you're going to usually always find Mongolian spots, those darker areas. Okay, so as far as you're concerned, unless you actually have the birth record, you won't be able to report this as a Mongolian spot or as a bruise because you don't know. So you're going to have to describe what you see. But if you really don't know that this is a Mongolian spot, that you actually have the child's birth record or you know the child, you're going to have to report this as an abuse report. You can't say they're bruises, but what else could you put down? How does the child act when you come into their space? You know, do they duck? Is there any rainbow effect? Are there any different colors there? Those would be things that you could add to it. In these two cases, yes, it's going to come back as birthmarks and not abuse, but you don't have the right to ignore that. You're going to have to make that report. Anybody have an idea what this is? It's called coining or Kaogao. Primarily, it's an Asian medical spiritual practice. So we're talking cultural diversity here. The child has either had a backache or an upper respiratory infection. A silver coin, which is why it's called coining, the edge of a silver spoon, a porcelain cup, or a plate is rubbed really hard on the areas that are hurt or are ill. You know, it's like rubbing out the disease, rubbing out the bad spirits. And we'll talk about it from an abuse standpoint in a moment. What about this? It's called cupping. I'm not going to give any other term for it because it depends on the culture. I used to say that it was predominantly an Hispanic medical spiritual practice, but I do a lot of classes with translators and interpreters, and I now know that Ukrainian medicine, Sudanese, Chinese, that there are a lot of different medicines and cultural practices that do use cupping. You know, that once again, it is to like suck out the disease, to suck out the bad spirits. A suction cup is heated. It can be heated from anything as minor as a match, so you're not talking about a major heat source, up to a full flame. You could have herbs, different medicines in there that are burned. So in this particular case, these are like hot hickeys. These are actually suction cup bruising. But in some areas, you're going to find that it is literally a burn. So are these child abuse? We're talking about cultural diversity. I have one friend who's a child abuse investigator, and she said, of course these are abuse. But she said, you know, the parents may not realize what Iowa's law is on abuse. So she said she'll go talk to them about it, explain what Iowa's law is, tell them I'm not going to report you for abuse this time. But if I have to come back again, I will have to do that. I have another friend who investigates abuse. She said, wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They have a right to their medical spiritual practices. So even within the State Department that investigates, you can have a difference of opinion. So my first friend said, but let's talk about the law. Say that the father of either one of these children runs a red light. Officer pulls him over and says, excuse me, sir, are you aware that you ran a red light? And he goes, sir, we don't have red lights in my country. Is he going to get a ticket? Yes. Not a warning. I checked on that. He will get a ticket because it's the law. So from that standpoint, regardless of what your beliefs are, you're going to have to make a report on either or both of these children. Depending on who investigates, depending on the situation, you may or may not like the response that you get with that. We're going to talk for just a few minutes about sexual abuse. Okay. In civil law, there is not a definition for sexual abuse. Criminal law, there is. And so, like a hot potato, usually as fast as Department of Human Services can get rid of a sexual abuse issue, they will. Now, they'll still monitor it, but they're going to switch it to criminal law as fast as they can because the definition is under the criminal code. As far as just, some of the subcategories with it, you can see that there are a lot. And there are several criminal laws on sexual abuse. If you have any handouts with it, there actually is a full page that you could read up on those. And unless you're going to be a sexual therapist or a sexual counselor, you don't need to know the material. It is there strictly as a resource. And then sex crimes based on age. Sometimes I'll have people say, well, Di, what about statutory rape? What about a 4-year rule, difference in age between child and perpetrator? It's criminal law, and I don't get into the details on those because that's not mandatory reporting of child abuse as far as the details of where does it fall. Okay? But the problem comes into is really the response of it, even more so than the age of the child. Let's say I walk into my house and there's my 16-year-old having sex with this guy. I don't like him. She's been told she's never to have anything to do with him. He definitely isn't allowed in my house. And here he's having sex with my daughter. I call the police. I'm reporting him for rape. I want him out of her life. Generally, those investigations are going to be done as a joint law enforcement and Department of Human Services. Department of Human Services will look at it and say, okay, we have a 16-year-old, so we have a child. We have a circumstance because mom is charging a sexual assault. Wait a minute, where's the caretaker? My 16-year-old is capable of staying home at periods of time without a caretaker. So Department of Human Services are going to say, it's not ours. But let's say my daughter's profoundly developmentally disabled. We have a child. We have a perpetrator or a circumstance. Wait a minute, where's the caretaker? Now I am partially responsible by omission because I failed to keep my daughter safe. Granted, even if Department of Human Services are going to continue with that case, we still have a crime because a sexual assault is criminal. And so law enforcement are going to be involved. If the law enforcement says to my daughter, did he hurt you? Heck no, we're in love. We're getting married in 2 years. They don't have a victim. They don't have a case. But let's say my daughter said, yeah, I told him no, and he didn't stop, and I really hurt. They're going to end up calling an ambulance. They're going to take her to a medical center. They're going to go follow through with a rape charge. Okay, and the perpetrator is either way. The perpetrator is going to be looked at as far from a criminal standpoint with it. So the age, the circumstances may change the picture with Department of Human Services, law enforcement. This particular picture, these are hickeys that were put on the daughter by the father during sex. This is a rope burn, like once again a father-daughter situation during sex. It didn't matter if she could breathe, if she hurt. It was all about his gratification. We're talking about indicators of sexual abuse. If you were to say rape, even that word sounds hurtful, painful, harsh. And so you would expect to find bruising, bleeding, infection, some damage with it. But aside from that, a lot of times we don't pay attention to other indicators that are there. And when we are talking about sexual abuse of children, one of the biggest indicators is a change in their behavior, a change in their language skills and their behavior. So suddenly you're going to have hints of sexual activity, maybe the words, maybe the actions. You have a child that does masturbate, they do have sex play, like playing doctor, and suddenly they ramp it up. It's just almost nonstop compulsion. And basically that is, somebody looked at me, I just want to know what it's all about. You can have a child that suddenly becomes, sexually aggressive or sexually seductive. I know an 11-year-old who suddenly French kissed her father goodnight. Now, a kiss on the cheek had always been part of their bedtime routine. A French kiss? Where did she get that knowledge? That's a change in behavior. If we were talking about physical abuse, and I would say, wait a minute, who hurt my child? But for some reason, when we're talking about sexual abuse, first, as parents, as caretakers, we step back and go, what did we do wrong? We don't immediately assume somebody else is responsible. It's who forgot to put the blocks on the computer? Who forgot to, what were we watching, on TV last night? Like, for some reason it is our fault that we have a change in the child's behavior. Then when we realize that it wasn't, our fault, then we're going to say, who hurt my kid? Okay, so there's that change. You can have a child that suddenly starts to regress. A 14-year-old buying candy pacifiers. You could have a child that is babysitting, and they say, hey kids, let's play house. I get to be the baby. They may take their blankie out of the drawer or their teddy bear off the shelf and to cuddle with at night because they need their security back. It's a change in behavior. I have one of my grandsons, when he was 18 months old, suddenly behavior changed. He suddenly, he loved going to daycare. Mommy would unhook his seatbelt and he would jump out of their van and he'd run to daycare because he just absolutely loved it. All of a sudden the behavior changed. Mommy would let him out of his car seat. He would jump, but he would leap on my daughter-in-law. He would put a stranglehold around her neck. He'd wrap his little legs around her waist and he would scream. He didn't want to go to daycare. Trying to change his diapers, he would clamp his legs together so you couldn't take his diaper off. When you could finally get his diaper off, there were these odd little red marks all over that area of his body. Checking him out, could never find any sexual damage. I could not identify what the red marks were. But there was that whole difference, that change in behavior. Mommy went to pick him up one day, and usually, he was ready for her. She got there and he wasn't there. So she said, well, where is he? And daycare provider said, well, he's in timeout. He's back in the bedroom. When my daughter-in-law got there, both of his eyes were totally swollen, completely shut. He had cried so hard and so long he couldn't open his eyes. She said, to how long has he been in timeout? 2 hours. An 18-month-old has the attention span of a flea. 2 hours? There was that, everything about that picture was wrong. He came back as unfounded. We got daycare changed, and fortunately, he's back to being that bubbly little kid that he was before. And I hope he grows up and never remembers it. But it's that change in behavior. When you suddenly see a child that changes and they start wearing multiple layers of clothing, okay, that could be fad and fashion. But likewise, it could be an indicator of sexual assault. If I'd had more clothes on, it would have taken longer to get me undressed. This wouldn't have happened to me. You could have changes in bowel and bladder patterns. Part of it could be, if I'd been a baby and had a wet soiled diaper, this wouldn't have happened. Part of it could be the body areas that are being damaged. And then another indicator with a female could be pregnancy. So we see a lot more indicators in sexual abuse than usually we think about sexual abuse, rape, but in fact there are a lot of other problems that we need to pick up on. And we're going to take a break.